Hello there. It is History with a Cardinal here, and today we'll be talking about a topic that was critical to World War II. Yes, another World War II video, and still about North Africa, but not one that many people have heard of. So, let's get into it, I guess. Alright. So, Operation Sonnenblume. That was the code name for the first deployment of German forces to assist in the battle for North Africa. Let's get into it. Context first. Because, as anyone who's ever read a history textbook knows, I'm assuming you have, if you're watching this video, even though it's super annoying sometimes. I'll try to make it not annoying. Although my rambling's probably more annoying than me just telling you what's going on. Here, let's just go. So, the Italians pleaded the Germans to bring to support to their forces in North Africa because they were losing horribly. They'd had an initially successful attack on Egypt, but then they basically completely botched it. They tried to stop and set up camp for defenses, but they were taken completely they were completely surprised by some British attacks and raids and forced back, and even lost most of the original territory they'd started with, even though at the beginning of the campaign they'd almost beaten Britain, simply because they used blitzkrieg tactics similar to Germany. So, aside from one Italian highway and a small railroad on the north coast, small railroad system, there was almost no easy way to transport supplies and reinforcements across Libya. To support the Italian forces, Duche's Africa Corps, sorry if I butchered that pronunciation, was organized and deployed to North Africa. And then there was a surprise attack. Rommel's armored cars, which were faster and heavier armed than the British ones, and the lack of British aerial presence, led to the British being taken completely by surprise when Rommel attacked after being deployed with the Africa Corps to North Africa. And for a week and a half, from the 24th of March to the 2nd of April, the Germans advanced almost unopposed until they had to stop to collect fuel between the 3rd and 5th of April. Another reason the attack was so successful was that the British tanks were low on supply, heavily outnumbered, and heavily outgunned by the German tanks, and the Germans just also had those advantages in general. Bleh. They had more men, more supplies, and better weapons. The battle itself, or at least this first advance by Rommel, ended by the 8th of April. The British had finally reorganized by the end of it, and managed to halt the Axis advance, but not before the Axis had taken back all of Libya, except for Tobruk. The British were able to hold the line against this offensive after this point, but Tobruk would be besieged for nearly a year. So, that brings us to the closing effects already. One effect was the failure of the Germans to take Tobruk, simply because the British had reorganized near the end of the offensive, just before the Axis would have otherwise overrun the entire country. It also led to possibly the overall prolongation of the Second World War, because of the German intervention in North Africa, where otherwise the Italian forces would have likely been overrun by the British. Because the Italians had inferior equipment and extremely low morale, considering their massive advantage that they'd had been completely shattered by them not being good enough to use strategy. Not good enough sounds like I'm being cruel. I mean, they just didn't. And it drained Axis resources. This is kind of the moral of the story of the North African War. It wasn't critical to either side, but it drained valuable resources from both. If Germany hadn't intervened in North Africa, they would have been able to send those troops to fight in Russia, or possibly to help prepare for an invasion of Britain. And if they had just better supplied the troops there, they would have been able to take the British out of North Africa, and having more resources, possibly able to organize a better offensive against the Soviet Union. The Axis went with a weird middle zone strategy, not wanting to completely devote to the area, but not wanting to leave their allies out hanging either. And they suffered severely for it. And this is something related to what many people call the butterfly effect, where one small decision can have large implications. The decision of the Axis to get involved in the war for North Africa, or at least Germany to get involved in the battle, but not send enough supplies to win the war quickly, so that their troops could get back to the main battle in the Soviet Union, or maybe preparation for an invasion of Britain, meant that they were in the middle. They didn't take North Africa, but they were still devoting enough resources that it was a severe drain on what they had, which was less and less the further the war went on. At least after France was taken. Their decision to commit, but not commit as much as was necessary, could have been one of the deciding factors in them losing the war. Because if they had committed fully, they would have had more resources. And possibly never had to worry about the invasion of Italy, because then Malta would be the only suitable staging point for an invasion, and it would have been surrounded by German ships and probably attacked by remnants of the Luftwaffe. The German Air Force. It was called the Luftwaffe, or something to that similarity. If they hadn't done this the way they did, only not devoting enough resources to win, but devoting enough to drain their economy, they could have won. Think about that for a second. Even though the North African War wasn't essential to either side in means of, Germany wasn't being invaded here. Their ally was. And Britain easily had the upper hand over the Italians. This part of the war was not critical to anyone except maybe Italy. Had Germany decided to not intervene, or decided to go full out, the entire history of that war could have changed. Now, I don't honestly think Germany would have won still. The USSR had too many men. They overran defenses, and they sent troops through minefields as if they were not there. That's almost a direct quote from one of their generals. You can look it up. And an invasion of America for Germany, unless America never got involved for some reason, would not be anything they could take on, especially after fighting the Soviet Union for years. This one decision, this one war that many people probably never heard of and wasn't even really highly consequential immediately in the war that it was part of, could have just led to the changing of the entire history of the modern world. Because if Hitler won, then fascism at best became a strong opposer of democracy, and at worst became the dominant world ideology. That's a scary thought. We'll continue another time.